On the morning of September 20th, 1944, thick fog blanketed the rolling hills of eastern France near the town of Harcourt in Lorraine. Temperatures hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit as the autumn chill settled over the battlefield, where American and German armored forces were locked in what would become one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. Through this impenetrable curtain of mist, German Panther tanks moved silently toward their objectives, confident that the weather had grounded American air support and rendered their advance virtually invisible to defending forces. What the German commanders did not anticipate was that circling above the fog layer, waiting with the patience of a hunting hawk, was a fabric-covered aircraft weighing barely 640 pounds empty, powered by a 65-horsepower engine that produced less power than many modern lawn tractors. Strapped beneath its thin wings were 6 M1 bazookas, transforming what German tankers had dismissively called a toy plane into one of the most unlikely tank-killing platforms of World War II. The pilot of this improbable weapon was a 32-year-old former high school history teacher who had grown tired of merely observing battles and had decided to join them directly. This is the story of how an unarmed reconnaissance plane became a feared tank destroyer, how a mild-mannered educator became known as the maddest man in the air, and how innovation born from frustration would earn one pilot the distinction of becoming the only American aviator to achieve tank ace status, flying an aircraft that was never designed to fire a shot. Before we dive into this remarkable story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The Unlikely Warrior. Charles Carpenter was born on September 29, 1912 in rural Illinois, one of 6 children in a family that would lose their farm during the Great Depression. The hardship of those years shaped Carpenter's character, instilling in him a resilience and determination that would serve him well in the years to come. Through scholarships earned by academic excellence and athletic ability, he attended the Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo, Illinois, and later Center College in Danville, Kentucky. By the time America entered World War II, Carpenter had established himself as a respected history teacher at a high school in Moline, Illinois. He was 21 years old, married, and had already started a family. Many men in his position might have sought deferment from military service, but Carpenter felt a sense of duty that transcended personal comfort. He enlisted in the United States Army and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, eventually training as an artillery spotter pilot. The L-4 Grasshopper that Carpenter would fly into combat was the military designation for what was essentially a Piper J-3 Cub, one of the most beloved civilian aircraft in American aviation history. The transformation from civilian trainer to military observer required minimal modification. As William Piper Jr. famously observed, all they had to do was paint the Cub olive drab to produce a military airplane. A plexiglass skylight and rear windows were added for improved visibility, but mechanically the L-4 remained virtually identical to its civilian counterpart. The specifications of the L-4 Grasshopper reveal just how modest this aircraft truly was. With an empty weight of 640 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight of 1,100 pounds, the entire aircraft weighed less than a modern compact car. Its single Continental engine produced just 65 horsepower, giving the plane a maximum speed of 85 miles per hour when carrying only a pilot. With an observer and radio equipment aboard, which often exceeded the aircraft's designed weight capacity, the Grasshopper's performance became even more modest. Its cruising speed was a leisurely 75 miles per hour, and it could remain airborne for approximately 3 hours with a range of 225 miles. Yet these seemingly modest specifications were precisely what made the L-4 ideal for its intended mission. Its slow speed and remarkable low-speed handling characteristics allowed it to loiter over battlefields at altitudes of just a few hundred feet, observing enemy positions and directing artillery fire with unprecedented precision. The aircraft could land and take off from impossibly short fields, required minimal maintenance, and could be operated from forward positions that kept pilots close to the action. But being close to the action when flying an unarmed, fabric-covered aircraft presented its own set of challenges. Carpenter arrived in France in 1944 as part of the build-up following the D-Day invasion. He was assigned to the 4th Armored Division, one of the most aggressive and effective armored units in the European theater, operating under the command of General George Patton's Third Army. The 4th Armored had distinguished itself during the breakout from Normandy and the subsequent dash across France, earning a reputation for speed, audacity, and effectiveness that made it a source of pride for American forces and concern for German defenders. As an artillery spotter pilot, Carpenter's official duties were clearly defined. He was to fly over enemy positions, identify targets, relay their coordinates to artillery batteries, and observe the fall of shells to provide corrections. It was vital work that saved countless American lives and destroyed enemy positions that would have otherwise been impossible to locate. The L-4 pilots were credited with directing more explosive tonnage onto enemy targets than entire bomber squadrons, all while flying aircraft that carried no offensive weapons of their own.
But for a man like Carpenter, whose personal philosophy could be summarized in his own words as attack, attack, and then attack again, the purely observational role began to feel inadequate. During missions over Normandy, he would watch American infantry pinned down by enemy fire, would see tanks and armored vehicles that he could identify but not engage, would observe targets that artillery could not immediately address due to range or ammunition constraints. The frustration of being able to see the enemy but unable to directly strike at them gnawed at him. The solution came to Carpenter during those weeks in Normandy, born from the observation that his L-4, despite its modest capabilities, possessed certain advantages that even the most powerful fighters lacked. The Grasshopper could fly slowly enough to make precise observations and could approach targets at extremely low altitudes using terrain features for concealment. Its fabric-covered wooden frame and small engine made it nearly silent in flight, especially when gliding with the engine throttled back. German troops often did not realize the small aircraft was above them until it had already passed overhead. What if, Carpenter reasoned, this inherently stealthy platform could be given teeth? The M1 bazooka was a proven anti-tank weapon that infantry used effectively at close range. Its rocket projectile, while not as powerful as a tank cannon or aircraft bomb, was capable of penetrating the armor of German vehicles when striking at the right angle. The bazooka weighed approximately 13 pounds and was 54 inches long, making it manageable in size. If these weapons could be mounted beneath the wings of his L-4, Carpenter could transform his observation aircraft into a tank killer. The modification was elegantly simple. Working with ground crew personnel who shared his innovative spirit, Carpenter fabricated mounting brackets that attached to the L-4's wing struts. Initially, he mounted 2 M1 bazookas, one under each wing, positioning them to fire forward in the direction of flight. The bazookas were loaded with high-explosive anti-tank rounds before takeoff, and Carpenter rigged a simple electrical firing system that allowed him to trigger the rockets from the cockpit. The additional weight and drag reduced the L-4's already modest performance, but the plane remained flyable and, more importantly, now possessed offensive capability. Carpenter christened his modified Grasshopper with a name that perfectly captured both its diminutive size and its newfound punch. Playing on the famous Rosie the Rocketer imagery that had become synonymous with American industrial might, he painted Rosie the Rocketer on the fuselage. The name was both whimsical and appropriate, suggesting that even the smallest contributors to the war effort could pack an unexpected wallop. First blood and escalation. Carpenter's first opportunity to test his modified aircraft came during operations in Normandy. Spotting a German armored car that was harassing American positions, he positioned his L-4 for an attack run, throttled the engine to reduce noise, and descended to an altitude of approximately 100 meters. The German crew, accustomed to dismissing the small observation planes as threats, did not react with urgency as the Grasshopper approached. When Carpenter triggered his rockets at close range, the result exceeded his expectations. The bazooka rounds struck the armored car with devastating effect, disabling the vehicle and likely killing its crew. The success of this initial engagement convinced Carpenter that his concept was viable, but he also recognized that 2 bazookas provided only 2 shots before he had to return to base for rearming. If he was going to make a significant impact, he needed more firepower. Working again with his ground crew, Carpenter modified the mounting system to accommodate 6 M1 bazookas, 3 beneath each wing. This configuration would become standard for Rosie the Rocketer throughout the remainder of Carpenter's combat career. As word of Carpenter's unauthorized tank hunting spread through the division, reactions were mixed. Some officers viewed his activities with concern, worried that he was taking unnecessary risks and deviating from his assigned mission. Others, recognizing both the tactical value of his attacks and the boost to morale they provided, offered quiet encouragement. Eventually, Carpenter received official approval for his modifications, though the paperwork carefully documented that he was conducting experimental operations in support of divisional objectives. The German reaction to Carpenter's activities evolved rapidly. Initially, German troops paid little attention to the L-4 Grasshoppers that buzzed overhead, recognizing them as observation aircraft that posed no direct threat. Standing orders instructed German forces to avoid firing on spotter planes when possible, as muzzle flashes and smoke from anti-aircraft weapons revealed positions that would immediately be targeted by American artillery. But once Carpenter began destroying vehicles with his bazooka-armed Grasshopper, German troops received new instructions. As Carpenter himself noted in interviews with reporters, word must have been getting around among those German soldiers to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time he showed up, they shot with everything they had. They never used to bother Cubs. The bazookas must have been bothering them quite a bit. This shift in German response dramatically increased the danger Carpenter faced. Flying at low altitude and slow speed in an unarmored aircraft made him vulnerable to even small arms fire. The fabric-covered L-4 offered no protection whatsoever, and a single well-placed bullet through the engine or control surfaces could bring the plane down. Carpenter's survival depended on surprise, speed of attack, and his ability to use terrain features for concealment. He became expert at approaching targets from unexpected angles, using valleys and tree lines to mask his approach, and attacking out of the sun when possible to reduce the time defenders had to react.
By mid-September 1944, the rapid advance of Patton's Third Army across France had finally stalled. The primary reason was logistical rather than tactical. The speed of the American advance had outrun supply lines, and fuel shortages became critical. Patton's forces found themselves in the Lorraine region of eastern France, specifically around the Moselle River near the towns of Nancy and Lunéville, with insufficient fuel to continue their drive toward Germany. This operational pause gave German forces a crucial opportunity to regroup and counterattack. Adolf Hitler, enraged by the loss of France and desperate to halt the American advance, ordered a major counteroffensive in Lorraine. The 5th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, was tasked with destroying American bridgeheads over the Moselle River and, if possible, recapturing significant territory. The German force assembled for this operation was formidable, comprising 262 tanks and assault guns organized into multiple panzer brigades and divisions. The tanks included the feared Panther, arguably the best medium tank of the war, as well as PZK FW-4 tanks and various assault guns.
The American forces in the region, primarily Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, were significantly outnumbered in terms of armored vehicles. However, the Americans possessed advantages that would prove decisive. They had superior intelligence about German movements and intentions. They controlled the air with fighter bombers of the 19th Tactical Air Command ready to strike German columns when weather permitted. They occupied favorable defensive terrain around the town of Aricourt, and they had crews with more combat experience and better tactical training than the hastily assembled German Panzer units. The German offensive began on September 18, 1944, with an attack near Luneville that was beaten back with heavy losses. But this was merely the prelude to the main effort. On September 19, 1944, German forces bypassed Luneville and struck northward toward Aricourt, where Combat Command A had established a thinly held salient. The morning of September 19th dawned with heavy fog and intermittent rain, weather conditions that grounded American air support and gave German armor a significant tactical advantage. Throughout September 19th and into September 20th, German Panzer units probed American defenses, seeking weak points and attempting to penetrate to Combat Command A's headquarters area. American tank destroyers and Sherman tanks engaged the Panthers and PZKFW-4s in running firefights that demonstrated the importance of tactical positioning. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. But when American crews used terrain and the fog to maneuver onto the flanks of German tanks where armor was thinner, they achieved kills that belied the Sherman's reputation as technically inferior. The Mad Major's finest hour. The morning of September 20th, 1944, brought more of the same weather that had characterized the previous days of fighting. Thick fog filled the valleys and low areas around Aricourt, reducing visibility to near zero at ground level. For the German commanders planning their operations that day, the continued poor weather seemed like a blessing, as it would keep American fighter bombers grounded and allow German armor to maneuver without fear of air attack. Carpenter took off from his forward airstrip in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing through the fog layer to clear air above. The experience of breaking through fog into brilliant sunshine was always surreal, like emerging into a different world. Below him, an impenetrable white blanket covered the battlefield. Above, cloudless sky stretched to the horizon. He circled patiently, waiting for any break in the fog that would allow him to observe what was happening below. Around noon, after hours of circling, Carpenter noticed that the fog was finally beginning to lift. Breaks appeared in the white blanket, revealing patches of the terrain below. Through one of these breaks, Carpenter spotted movement that immediately captured his attention. German Panther tanks, moving in company strength, were advancing toward Aricourt. The formation included approximately a dozen Panthers, along with supporting armored cars, all pushing toward the American positions with the confidence of a force that believed itself unobserved. What Carpenter saw from his vantage point above the fog was a tactical situation of considerable urgency. The German armor was advancing toward the headquarters area of Combat Command A. Several American support units, including a waterpoint crew that had been providing essential logistic support, were in danger of being overrun or cut off. If the German attack succeeded in penetrating to the headquarters area, it could cause chaos in the American defensive network and potentially compromise the entire position at Aricourt. Carpenter made his decision in an instant. Banking his L-4 into a steep dive, he descended through the remaining wisps of fog toward the advancing German column. The Panthers below represented the most dangerous targets he had yet attempted to engage. These were not lightly armored cars or soft-skinned vehicles, but 45-ton battle tanks armed with powerful 75mm guns and protected by sloped armor that could defeat most American tank guns at range. Attacking them with bazookas mounted on a fabric-covered observation plane seemed absurd, yet Carpenter did not hesitate. The key to destroying a tank with a bazooka was hitting it from above or from the side, where armor was thinnest. Tank designers concentrated the heaviest armor on the front and, to a lesser extent, the sides of their vehicles, because these were the most likely to face enemy fire. The upper armor, designed primarily to protect against artillery fragments and small arms fire, was much thinner. This made top attack the ideal approach for aircraft-delivered anti-tank weapons, and Carpenter's dive angle gave him exactly this advantage. As he descended toward the German column, anti-aircraft fire began to rise toward him. Machine gun tracers arced through the air, and larger caliber weapons joined in as German crews recognized the threat. The small L-4 presented a difficult target, but the volume of fire was intense enough that hits were inevitable if Carpenter remained in the engagement zone for long. He pressed his attack with the determination that had earned him his reputation among both American and German forces. Carpenter triggered his bazookas in rapid succession as he dove through the barrage of defensive fire. The rockets whooshed away from the wings of the Grasshopper, trailing smoke as they accelerated toward their targets. Several rounds struck home, impacting the top armor of Panther tanks with the distinctive flash and crack of shaped charge warheads detonating. While a single bazooka hit would not always destroy a heavy tank, it could disable critical components, injure or kill crew members, or start fires that would force the crew to abandon the vehicle. Having expended all 6 of his rockets, Carpenter hauled back on the control stick and climbed away from the German column, nursing his damaged aircraft back toward the American lines. The L-4 had taken hits during the attack run. Ground crews would later find bullet holes in the fabric covering and structural damage to the wings, testament to how close Carpenter had come to being shot down. But the plane remained flyable, and Carpenter's first priority was to return to base, rearm, and return to the battle. The rearming process was quick, as ground crews had practiced the procedure repeatedly. Fresh bazookas were mounted beneath the wings, electrical connections were verified, and Carpenter was airborne again within minutes. He returned to the battlefield and conducted a second attack run against the German armor, again diving through intense defensive fire to deliver his rockets at close range. When these were expended, he returned to base once more. On his third sortie of the afternoon, Carpenter continued his relentless attacks against the German formation. By this time, the Panther tanks that remained operational were attempting to withdraw, their attack momentum broken by the combination of American ground fire and the unexpected assault from the air. The trapped American waterpoint crew, who had witnessed Carpenter's attacks from their vulnerable position, were able to escape capture and destruction as the German advance faltered. When the afternoon's action was tallied, official records credited Carpenter with destroying 2 Panther tanks and several armored cars. The number of rockets he had fired exceeded 16, delivered across 3 separate combat sorties in a single afternoon. The psychological impact of his attacks likely exceeded their physical destruction. German tankers who had expected to advance under cover of fog found themselves under attack from an aircraft they had previously dismissed as harmless, and this shook their confidence in ways that mere numbers cannot capture. The tank ace. The weeks following the Battle of Aricourt saw Carpenter continue his aggressive tactics, hunting German armor whenever opportunity presented. The terrain of eastern France, with its rolling hills, patches of forest, and network of small roads, provided numerous opportunities for a patient pilot to find targets. Carpenter developed techniques for distinguishing occupied tanks from knocked-out hulks, for identifying camouflaged vehicles by the disturbance patterns in surrounding vegetation, and for predicting likely routes that German armor would use to move between positions. In October 1944 alone, Carpenter was officially credited with destroying 4 tanks and an armored truck, adding to his tally from September. The exact number of vehicles he destroyed remains a subject of some debate. Official military records, which required multiple forms of verification before awarding credit for enemy vehicles destroyed, list 6 tank kills, including 2 Tigers, the heavily armored German heavy tanks that were among the most feared vehicles on the battlefield. Unofficial accounts from witnesses, including both American and German personnel who observed his attacks, suggest the actual number might have been as high as 14 tanks, plus numerous other armored vehicles. Regardless of the precise count, Carpenter's achievements were sufficient to earn him the designation of Tank Ace, the only American aviator to achieve this distinction. Tank aces were typically ground forces personnel who had destroyed 5 or more enemy tanks from their own tanks. Achieving this status from the cockpit of an unarmed observation plane was unprecedented. The recognition Carpenter received extended beyond statistics. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, recognizing his extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Aricourt. He received the Bronze Star with Oak Cluster and the Air Medal with Oak Cluster, accumulating a collection of decorations that testified to his repeated acts of valor. But perhaps more meaningful than medals was the respect he earned from the soldiers of the 4th Armored Division, who knew that the crazy pilot in the Cub with bazookas was willing to take risks to support them. German forces came to fear and respect Carpenter's attacks. Intelligence reports indicated that German commanders issued specific warnings about bazooka-armed L-4 aircraft and ordered their troops to engage them on sight. In the hierarchy of threats that German soldiers faced, the small observation planes had been elevated from nuisance to genuine danger. Carpenter was aware of this change and knew it meant that every mission carried increased risk, but it did not diminish his aggressive approach to combat. American reporters discovered Carpenter's story and featured him in articles that brought his exploits to wider attention. The nickname Bazooka Charlie appeared in print, and Carpenter became a minor celebrity. The stories captured the David versus Goliath nature of his attacks, the image of a fabric-covered puddle jumper taking on armored monsters. Carpenter gave interviews in which his personality came through clearly. He was articulate and thoughtful, still very much the history teacher despite his transformation into warrior. When asked about his tactics, he emphasized preparation, patience, and the importance of surprise. When asked about fear, he acknowledged it, but noted that the mission required completion regardless of personal feelings.
By late 1944, the cumulative strain of months of combat flying, the constant exposure to danger, and the physical toll of his wound were affecting Carpenter's health. In 1945, not long after the war in Europe ended, Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. Medical opinions at the time gave him approximately 2 years to live. He received an honorable discharge in 1946 and returned to civilian life, uncertain how much time he had remaining. Against the odds, Carpenter lived for 2 more decades. He returned to teaching, resuming his career as a high school history teacher in Urbana, Illinois. During the summer months, he operated a boys' camp in the Ozarks, an establishment that focused on teaching outdoor skills and building character, bringing to youth education the same commitment to development that had characterized his approach to combat. Those who knew Carpenter in his post-war years describe him as a devoted teacher and a dedicated family man who spoke little about his wartime experiences unless specifically asked. Carpenter passed away on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53. He had far exceeded the 2-year life expectancy his doctors had predicted, but the cancer that had first appeared in 1945 finally claimed him. He was laid to rest with military honors, recognized as a veteran who had served with extraordinary distinction. The L-4 Grasshopper that Carpenter flew, bearing USAAF serial number 4330426, had its own remarkable journey after the war ended.
Built by the Piper Aircraft Company in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, during the first week of April 1944, it was accepted by the Army Air Forces and shipped overseas as part of the D-Day buildup. After its combat service with the 4th Armored Division, the aircraft was left in Europe as surplus military equipment, one of thousands of vehicles and aircraft abandoned or sold after hostilities ceased. An Austrian pilot purchased the L-4 and registered it as a civilian aircraft, painting it bright yellow as civilian Cubs were traditionally finished. For decades, it flew in obscurity in Austria, its extraordinary combat history unknown to its successive owners. Eventually, the aircraft was donated to the Austrian Aviation Museum at Graz Airport, where it was stored in a disassembled state, just another aging Piper Cub among many. In 2017, researchers working with the American Heritage Museum began investigating surviving World War II aircraft with notable combat records. Joe Shale, a research specialist with extensive knowledge of L-4 Grasshoppers and their service, discovered references to Carpenter's aircraft in archival documents. By tracing serial numbers and cross-referencing unit records, Shale and his team identified the yellow Cub stored in Austria as Rosie the Rocketer, the most successful tank-killing aircraft of World War II. The identification of 4330426 as Carpenter's aircraft was a discovery of considerable significance. While numerous World War II fighters and bombers survive in museums and private collections, very few have documented combat records that equal or exceed this modest observation plane. No other surviving aircraft, and indeed no surviving tank from any nation, could claim a tally of 6 confirmed enemy tank kills, plus additional armored vehicles destroyed. A generous donor acquired the aircraft from the Austrian Museum, and arrangements were made to return it to the United States for restoration. Colin Powers of La Pine, Oregon, undertook the painstaking work of restoring the L-4 to its original wartime configuration. The restoration included not only the basic airframe and engine, but also the recreation of the bazooka mounting system and the distinctive Rosie the Rocketer nose art that Carpenter had painted on the fuselage. Today, the restored L-4 is on display at the American Heritage Museum at the Collings Foundation in Hudson, Massachusetts. The aircraft is positioned in an attack attitude, suspended on wires as if diving toward a German Panther tank that is also part of the museum's collection. The display captures the dramatic nature of Carpenter's attacks and allows visitors to appreciate both the modest size of the Grasshopper and the audacity required to attack heavy tanks in such an aircraft. The L-4 is maintained in flying condition and participates in air shows and commemorative events, ensuring that Carpenter's story continues to reach new audiences. The story of Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer occupies a unique place in military aviation history. It represents the triumph of innovation and courage over apparent limitations, demonstrating that tactical effectiveness depends not merely on the capabilities of equipment, but on the imagination and determination of those who employ it. Carpenter took an aircraft that was never designed for combat in the direct sense and transformed it into a weapon system that achieved results far beyond its specifications.
The improvised nature of Carpenter's bazooka-armed Grasshopper should not obscure the genuine tactical value it provided. During critical moments of the Battle of Aricourt, when weather grounded conventional fighter bombers and American ground forces faced numerically superior German armor, Carpenter's attacks disrupted enemy formations and bought time for defensive positions to be reinforced. His presence over the battlefield forced German tanks to button up their hatches and maneuver defensively, reducing their effectiveness. The psychological impact of being attacked by an aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with unexpected force, and disappear before effective response could be organized, created uncertainty among German crews that affected their tactical decision-making. Carpenter was not the only L-4 pilot to arm his aircraft with bazookas. Several other pilots in different units experimented with similar modifications, recognizing the potential value of giving observation aircraft offensive capability. However, Carpenter was by far the most effective practitioner of this improvised tactic, and his success influenced how other pilots approached the challenge. The bazooka-armed Grasshopper never became standard doctrine, remaining an improvised solution employed by individual pilots. But it demonstrated the value of tactical flexibility and the importance of empowering personnel to innovate within their areas of responsibility. The broader significance of the L-4 Grasshopper in World War II extends beyond Carpenter's individual achievements. These humble aircraft, collectively nicknamed Grasshoppers or simply Cubs, proved to be among the most valuable tactical assets available to American ground commanders. Flying from forward airstrips that could be prepared in hours, operating in weather that grounded higher performance aircraft, and remaining airborne for extended periods at altitudes that provided detailed observation of battlefield conditions, L-4 pilots revolutionized artillery effectiveness and provided commanders with real-time intelligence that shaped tactical decisions. Field artillery officers who flew L-4s could observe the fall of shells and transmit immediate corrections, allowing American artillery to achieve accuracy that would have been impossible with ground-based observation alone. The mere presence of a Grasshopper over the battlefield forced enemy artillery to cease firing, as muzzle flashes would immediately draw counter-battery fire. In Italy, France, and Germany, L-4 pilots developed techniques for directing not only artillery, but also fighter bombers onto targets, serving as an early form of forward air controller. One L-4 pilot could, through directed artillery fire, bring more explosive force onto a target than a B-29 Superfortress could carry in its bomb bay. The broader institutional legacy of the L-4 Grasshopper program proved equally significant. The success of organic aviation, where aircraft and pilots were assigned directly to ground force commanders rather than being controlled centrally by Air Force headquarters, demonstrated the value of giving ground forces their own aerial assets. This experience laid the groundwork for the development of Army aviation as a distinct capability, eventually leading to widespread use of helicopters and later fixed-wing aircraft in support of ground operations. The principle that ground commanders needed responsive air support under their direct control rather than having to request assistance through Air Force channels became fundamental to American military doctrine. Reflections on courage and innovation. What made Charles Carpenter's achievements remarkable was not simply the number of enemy vehicles he destroyed, impressive though that tally was. Rather, it was his willingness to question the limitations that others accepted, to see possibility where conventional thinking saw only constraint, and to act on his convictions despite the very real dangers involved. Carpenter understood that the L-4 Grasshopper, while unsuitable for fighter combat against enemy aircraft, possessed characteristics that could be exploited for ground attack if the pilot was willing to accept the risks. The physics of Carpenter's attacks were brutally simple. He flew a slow, unarmored aircraft into the range of enemy weapons, attacked targets that could destroy him with a single hit, and repeated this process multiple times per mission. The fabric covering of the L-4 would not stop even pistol-caliber rounds, let alone the machine gun and cannon fire that German vehicles directed at him. His survival depended entirely on surprise, the difficulty of hitting a small maneuvering target, and fortune. The bullet holes found in his aircraft during post-war restoration demonstrate how close he came to being shot down. Yet Carpenter persisted in these attacks, not from recklessness, but from a calculated assessment that the risks were justified by the results. He saw American soldiers pinned down by enemy armor and recognized that he had the means to help them, even if doctrine and conventional thinking suggested his aircraft was unsuitable for the mission. This represents a form of moral courage that complements physical bravery, the courage to accept responsibility for innovative action, even when safer alternatives exist. The Germans, who initially laughed at Carpenter's toy plane, learned through hard experience that underestimating an opponent based on apparent limitations could prove fatal. The small, fabric-covered Grasshopper, powered by an engine that would be considered inadequate for a modern automobile, carried weapons that could destroy the most powerful tanks Germany could field.
The lesson transcends its specific historical context, reminding us that effectiveness in conflict depends on how capabilities are employed as much as on the capabilities themselves. Conclusion. The rolling hills of Lorraine, where Carpenter conducted many of his attacks, bear few visible scars from the battles of September 1944. The farms have been rebuilt, the fields are productive, and the small towns that were contested in bitter fighting have returned to peaceful obscurity. Visitors to the region today would find little to indicate that this quiet agricultural landscape was once the scene of one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front. But the memory of what happened there persists in the historical record and in the collections of museums that preserve the artifacts of that conflict. The restored L-4 Grasshopper hanging in the American Heritage Museum stands as a tangible connection to Carpenter's story, allowing visitors to see the actual aircraft that defied probability and expectation to become the most successful tank-killing aircraft of World War II. The modest size of the plane, the simplicity of its construction, and the improvised nature of its armament make Carpenter's achievements all the more impressive.